On the afternoon of June 19, 2001, 44-year-old Debbie Triplett and her husband Billy were stocking shelves in the small country grocery store that they owned in Clay County, Alabama. Billy and Debbie had run the store together for almost 20 years, and they had stocking shelves down to a science. They barely even had to look while they were doing it. So today, like most days, they spent the time talking and joking with each other. For as long as they'd been doing this, Billy and Debbie never got bored working at the store together. In fact, they didn't understand how anyone would get bored working with the person they loved, because the two of them had been pretty much inseparable from the moment they met back in 1982. At the time, Billy, who was 8 years older than Debbie, already owned the grocery store, but he'd been having trouble running it by himself. So, when Debbie came in looking for a job, he'd hired her right away. And it didn't take long for them to discover that they had a lot in common. They were both single parents, they loved living in a small town where they knew their kids would be safe, and they could talk to each other for hours without ever running out of things to say. Billy and Debbie's relationship had quickly gone from boss and employee to boyfriend and girlfriend to husband and wife. And their children from their previous marriages ended up loving each other as much as Debbie and Billy did. So they had all quickly formed this really tight-knit blended family. Now, almost 20 years later, the kids had grown up and moved out, but they all lived close by, so the blended family was still together. In the store, Billy kept stocking the shelves, but Debbie glanced up at the clock hanging over the counter and said that maybe they should call it a day. Billy was supposed to meet up with their son Randy, and if he wanted to do that and still get home in time for the first pitch of the Atlanta Braves baseball game, he needed to head out now. Everyone who knew Billy assumed he must have been born in an Atlanta Braves baseball cap, because he wore one pretty much every day. They also knew he absolutely hated to miss a Braves game. But today, Billy wasn't sure if he should just take off, because he really didn't like the idea of leaving Debbie alone at the store. The couple didn't like to talk about it, but on a night about 3 months earlier, when Billy was closing the store on his own, 3 men wearing ski masks had burst in, duct-taped Billy's mouth, shoved him into the walk-in cooler, and then robbed the cash register. By the time Billy had gotten out of the cooler, the men were long gone, but all he could think was, thank God Debbie was not here. Debbie could see the look of concern on her husband's face, and she told him not to worry. Those robbers had not been seen again. Besides, their daughter Michelle was coming by to keep her company for a while, and then she'd close the store because she had dinner plans. Billy thought about it for a second, and then said she was right. So he gave Debbie a kiss and said he would see her at home when she was finished with dinner. Later that afternoon, Debbie's daughter Michelle walked into the store, and the two women immediately started talking like they were best friends. Debbie had Michelle and her brother Michael with her first husband, but they had treated Billy as their dad since they were young, just like Billy's son, Randy, saw Debbie as his mother. Still, Debbie shared a bond with Michelle that was special, even among the kids. They saw or talked to each other every single day. Time always flew by when it was just the two of them, and today at the store was no different. They talked about everything that was going on in their lives, and when Michelle finally caught a glimpse of the clock, she said she needed to head out. But Michelle hesitated, because like Billy, she wanted to make sure her mom would be okay on her own. Despite Billy and Debbie rarely talking about the robbery, Michelle and her brothers knew all about it, and they worried about their parents constantly. Debbie said she'd be fine. She could take care of herself, and after all, she'd been closing up the store for 2 decades. Michelle knew better than to argue with her mother, so she told her that she loved her, and then she left. Debbie worked a while longer on her own, then started closing the store. She emptied the cash register and put all the money into a metal lockbox. She turned off the lights and walked outside with the box under her arm. Then she locked the door behind her and climbed into her minivan that was parked out front. And as she drove down the secluded country road outside the store, Debbie felt excited about her dinner plans, and she hoped the Braves were winning so Billy would be in a really good mood when she got home. Early the next morning, Debbie's daughter Michelle sat straight up in bed. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and she could feel her heart pounding. She was terrified, like she'd just had a nightmare. But Michelle knew the fear she was feeling was not because of a dream. Michelle believed that her connection to her mother was something way stronger than a typical bond between mom and daughter. It was almost psychic, like they shared a sixth sense or something. It was like they always knew when the other one was upset or in trouble. And right now, Michelle knew something really bad had happened. She reached over and grabbed her phone off the bedside table and called her mom. When she didn't get an answer, she immediately hung up and called her brother Michael. The second she heard Michael's voice, she said something was wrong with their mom, and since he could get there faster, he needed to get over to her house right away. Michael never doubted the intense connection between his sister and his mom, so he said he was on his way out the door. Michelle hung up the phone, got dressed, and ran out to her car. She sped down the road that cut through most of the small rural towns in Clay County, and then a few minutes later, she turned onto a dirt road that led to her parents' house. As Michelle pulled up in front of the house, she saw her brother pacing back and forth in the yard, and she heard the sound of a police siren in the distance. Michelle got out and ran straight to Michael. He wrapped his arms around her tight and just said, "Sister, they're gone." Early that afternoon, Agent Todd Wheels of the Alabama Bureau of Investigation drove down a 2-lane road lined by acres of trees on one side and a river on the other. This landscape, that would cause most people to feel like they were stranded in the middle of nowhere, felt completely familiar to Agent Wheels. He'd grown up in Clay County, which was not too far from here, so for him, it was like he was coming home. That morning, a call had come into the Bureau from the Clay County Sheriff's Department. County deputies had responded to a 911 call at Debbie and Billy Triplett's house. The second they walked inside, they knew the Sheriff's Department did not have the resources to handle this case, so they had asked the state police for help. Agent Wheels turned onto a dirt road and slowed down as he approached an old white wooden house that sat on a large piece of land that backed up to dense green woods. County police officers had already set up crime scene tape around the perimeter of the house, and a couple of deputies stood out front with a man and a woman in their 20s. Wheels parked his car and looked out at the man and woman, and he felt his heart sink, because he had known both of them since they were little kids. Wheels had grown up in a town not too far from where Michelle, Michael, and their brother Randy lived with their parents, and they had always attended rival schools. So Wheels had seen the entire family at football games, academic competitions, parties, and church functions for most of his life. Wheels took a breath, stepped out of the car, and walked over to Michelle and Michael. He said he hated seeing them under these circumstances, but he needed to look inside the house, and then he would come back out to talk to them. They both nodded like they barely heard what he said, and Wheels ducked under the crime scene tape, put on a pair of gloves, and headed inside. But before he could even take a few steps, he saw Debbie's body lying on the floor. She was surrounded by a huge pool of dried blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls. Wheels had worked homicides in much bigger places than this, cities that had reputations for violence, but this attack on Debbie looked as gruesome as anything he'd ever seen. He crouched down and found Debbie's purse beside her. He noticed bloodstains inside the purse, and it looked like somebody had rifled through it. Wheels thought this could be a sign that this was a robbery gone bad, that somebody had broken in, and then when they heard Debbie come home, they rushed over and killed her as soon as she walked inside. Wheels left Debbie's body and walked down a short hallway into the family room. And there, on the couch, he saw Billy's body, covered in blood as well. This was the first reported double homicide in Clay County in over 40 years, and Agent Wheels could not believe he knew the victims. Wheels approached Billy's body when something on the wall right above caught his attention. When he'd first walked into the room, he thought it was blood spatter, but now he could see it was red lipstick. And someone had used this lipstick to leave a message for the police. It was a single word: narc. At 4 p.m., several hours after Agent Wheels arrived at the scene, he was back in the family room, staring at the lipstick on the wall for what felt like the 10th time that day. But now he was with members of a state forensics team that had just arrived. Wheels had gone outside earlier to check on Michelle and Michael, and to ask them if they knew what their parents had been doing the night before. Michael said that he and his wife had met his mom for dinner after she closed the store, and then as far as he knew, she went straight home. And both siblings assumed that their dad had watched the Braves game and then just stayed in for the night. Back in the family room, Wheels and the forensics technicians could still not get over the violence that was inflicted on Billy. This was even more brutal than the attack on Debbie. This kind of rage made Wheels think that the attack must have been carried out by someone who had a close emotional connection to Billy. or by someone who was out for revenge. And the word narc also had strong connections to the drug world. As Wheels stood there, fixated on the wall, he heard people shouting outside, and he snapped out of his trance. He immediately turned around and ran out of the house. In the front yard, Wheels saw a man physically struggling with two deputies and yelling that he and his siblings needed to get inside. Their parents were in there. Wheels recognized this man as Billy's son, Randy. Back when they were teenagers, Wheels and Randy had been on their respective high school's Scholar Bowl teams, and they had developed a friendly rivalry with each other at academic competitions. Wheels darted across the yard, joined the deputies, and in his calm southern accent, told Randy he needed to back off. Randy stopped struggling and looked up at Wheels, and this look came across Randy's face like he didn't understand why this man was standing there. Randy squinted a little and then just said, "Tom?" Agent Wheels said he wished this was not how they were seeing each other for the first time in a while, but he needed Randy to calm down and step back. Randy took a deep breath and apologized to the deputies. He told Wheels he had lashed out because he was mad at himself. He'd missed the messages he'd gotten from Michelle and Michael, and he felt like he'd let his brother and sister down by not getting here earlier. Wheels said he understood. While the two men talked, Wheels heard someone shouting his name from across the yard. He looked over and saw a forensics tech standing by a minivan that was parked near the side of the house. Wheels told Randy to go wait with his siblings, and then he walked over to the van. The front passenger door was open, and the forensics tech said the van had been unlocked. He pointed to the passenger seat, and Wheels saw the keys to the van sitting there. But Wheels also saw something in the passenger side floorboard. It was an open, empty metal box turned over on its side. Wheels called out to the deputies to bring Randy, Michelle, and Michael over to the van, and when the three siblings got there, they didn't look surprised at all. Wheels asked them what the container was, and they told him it was the money box their parents put the cash from the register in every night when they closed the store. And their mom had a terrible habit of just leaving the box in her van when she got home. This clue definitely played into the idea that these murders were connected to a robbery, but maybe it was not a home robbery that got interrupted. Wheels asked the siblings if it was common knowledge around town that their parents put their money from the store in the box every night. Would someone have known Debbie had all that cash and maybe followed her home? The kids looked at each other for a moment, like they were talking without saying anything, and then Michelle said a few months earlier their parents' store had been robbed by some men at closing time, so these men might have known exactly where their parents put the money from the cash register. Wheels got a few more details about that robbery, and then he told the siblings they could go. They should have some time to grieve together in private. Wheels spent the whole day at the house, and it was dark outside when he met the members of the forensics team to get a final report for the day. They believed that Debbie and Billy had been killed the previous night. The team had also pulled blood samples from both bodies and from the rooms where they were found, and they had done a thorough sweep of the minivan. But the van appeared to have been completely wiped down before any investigators had even touched it. However, investigators were confident that with all the blood and all the fingerprints found inside the house, that they would still likely be able to get the print and DNA samples that belonged to the killer. At the time, DNA testing in Alabama was still a relatively slow process. It could take several weeks or even months to get results. Still, Wheels had a lot of faith in DNA testing, so he was willing to be patient. In the meantime, he had two distinct theories about the case. This was either a robbery gone bad, or Billy really had ratted somebody out to the authorities, likely over something having to do with the drug trade. On June 21st, so the day after the bodies had been discovered, Agent Wheels followed Michelle into her house, which was just a few miles away from her parents, and they sat down together in the small front room. Wheels spoke in the calm voice he almost always used on the job. He said he didn't want to imply that anybody was lying, but he had met with county police, and they had no record whatsoever of a robbery that took place at Billy and Debbie's store. So Wheels wanted to know what Michelle and her brothers had been talking about. Michelle sighed. She and her brothers were telling the truth. There had been a robbery. Their parents had just never reported it. Wheels looked totally confused by this. Why on earth would they keep something like that to themselves? Michelle laughed a little and said it was stupid, but her dad had been illegally selling wine and beer. and even a little moonshine out of the back of the store. And he thought if he reported the robbery, the cops would find out about it. In 2001, Clay County, Alabama was what's known as a dry county. This meant it was illegal to sell any alcohol within county limits. When Agent Wheels heard this news about Billy, he laughed just like Michelle had. This was the kind of thing he'd heard about his whole life growing up in Clay County. He knew Billy wasn't running some major bootlegging operation like people had done back during Prohibition. Instead, he was most likely just selling booze to his friends and to some people from town. But at the same time, Wheels could not shake the image of the word narc written on the wall above Billy's body. So he told Michelle he was not worried about Billy selling alcohol to his friends, but he needed to know if Billy was selling anything else illegal. Was Billy mixed up in the local drug trade? This question absolutely floored Michelle. She said there was no way her dad was dealing drugs. Wheels listened, and he didn't say anything, but he agreed with her. And not just because he had known Billy and the family. Wheels was familiar with the growing methamphetamine problem in the area, and he knew from working with colleagues in the state narcotics unit that a lot of the drugs were coming in from out of state, and that Billy did not fit the profile of most local meth dealers and users, who were often younger guys who didn't have steady jobs. So Wheels stood up and told Michelle that was all he needed for now. He said he'd check in with her as often as he could. But before he made it to the door, Michelle told him to wait. Wheels turned and walked back toward her. Michelle said again there was no way her dad was mixed up with drugs, but she did know somebody who was. It was a guy named Leonard Southers, and he happened to be one of Billy and Debbie's closest neighbors. Later that day, so still just one day after the discovery of the bodies, Agent Wheels pulled up to a house over a mile away from Billy and Debbie's. Michelle had been right. Everything was so isolated and spread out around here that this was definitely one of the closest homes to her parents. Wheels stepped out of his car, and he saw the lawn was completely overgrown and there were tools and a bunch of other stuff piled up all around. He took a few steps towards the house, and the screen door flew open. A skinny man in baggy jeans and a t-shirt rushed outside, demanding to know who Wheels was and what he was doing here. Wheels said everything was okay, and then asked the man if he was Leonard. The man nodded and said, "Who's asking?" Wheels introduced himself and said he was with the state police, but Leonard was not in any trouble. In fact, he needed Leonard's help. Wheels took a few more steps towards Leonard, and as he did, he could see track marks on both of his arms, clearly from injecting drugs. And the way Leonard fidgeted and picked at his skin made Wheels think he likely was a meth addict. Looking at Leonard, Wheels mostly just felt pity. This man obviously needed help, but that's not why Wheels was here right now. All of a sudden, Leonard raised both hands into the air to show he was not carrying a weapon, and then he moved towards Wheels. He leaned in really close and then pointed to the trees surrounding his house, and in a hushed voice, he asked if Wheels could see the men up there. Wheels turned and looked up at the trees, and as he did, Leonard started laughing. He said the men were in camouflage, so they were almost invisible, but he knew they were there. And he knew they were men like Wheels, agents that the government sent to watch him all the time. As calm as Wheels was, and as genuinely sympathetic as he tried to be whenever he was working a case, he knew he could change his personality on a dime when he needed to. It was like there was a switch in his head, and in that moment, Wheels flipped the switch. He stood up to his full height, raised his voice, and said Leonard was absolutely right. There were agents hiding in the trees, and if Leonard didn't tell him everything he knew about the deaths of Billy and Debbie Triplett, these agents in the trees would swarm. They would take Leonard away, and he would no longer be a free man. Leonard suddenly looked scared, but he quickly said he did want to help. He had heard Billy and Debbie got killed, and he was sad about it. They were nice people, both of them. Wheels flipped the switch again, and his calm voice came back. He told Leonard if he wanted to help, he needed to tell the truth and admit if he had gone over to Billy and Debbie's house to rob them, maybe for drug money. Leonard shook his head. He would never steal from them or try to hurt them. Wheels spoke with Leonard a while longer in the front yard, and by the time he left, he had a primary suspect. Leonard was a drug addict, and he was extremely paranoid. There was even a chance Leonard had convinced himself that his neighbor Billy was going to turn him in to the police for buying and using drugs, which in Leonard's mind would make Billy a narc. In the days following the murders, Agent Wheels had his team dig into Leonard's background and his history of drug use. Still, Wheels did not want to overlook anything, especially if it was because of a personal bias. He did not believe that Billy or Debbie had any connection to the local drug trade, but he needed to make sure. He asked for help from the state narcotics unit, and they said they would search their records to see if Billy or Debbie ever appeared as suspects or informants, or if any agents knew anything about them. In the meantime, Wheels was still waiting on the results of the DNA tests from the blood samples taken at the crime scene. But he did get an update on the fingerprints found throughout the house. At this point, all of the prints that had been pulled matched Billy, Debbie, and their kids, who had provided prints to the county police. So investigators figured the killer must have worn gloves, which probably meant they would not find any useful prints on the cash box either. This was not surprising, but Wheels still got frustrated. The investigation was in its early days, but he had hoped he might get lucky with the fingerprints and find a clear piece of evidence that pointed to the killer. Wheels always felt a real responsibility when investigating a murder to try to bring the killer to justice as quickly as possible, but he knew this case was something different. He had never worked a homicide where he actually knew the victims and their family, and so every day that he didn't find the killer made him feel like he was letting Michelle, Michael, and Randy down. About a week after the murders, Wheels got word from the narcotics unit that they didn't find anything on Billy or Debbie. It seemed pretty clear they had no connection to illegal drugs. In addition to that, because Billy and Debbie never filed a report about that store robbery, there were no leads on the men who had committed that crime. So, Wheels was basically where he'd been a week earlier, with the drug addict Leonard as his primary suspect. Still, Leonard being an addict and being paranoid about men in the trees did not automatically make him a killer. Wheels had to find something concrete to tie him to the murders. And about 1 week later, Wheels was going back over his notes when he got a phone call. And as soon as he heard the caller's nervous, shaky voice, he knew it was Leonard. And Leonard said that Wheels needed to come to his house right away because he had found blood on his money. Not long after this call, Agent Wheels found himself back in Leonard's front yard, not really knowing what to expect or what Leonard finding blood on his money even meant. Leonard stepped outside, walked over to Wheels, and showed him a stack of $1 and $5 bills he had in a shoebox. Wheels put on his gloves and picked up a few of the bills, and this didn't look like regular cash. The bills were faded, and there were these weird white spots on them, almost like bleach or something. And in that moment, Wheels understood what was going on, and he just stood there dumbfounded for a second, because he realized someone had put all of this money in a washing machine. They had literally tried to launder the money. This did seem like something Leonard might try, not understanding that money laundering was actually a complex illegal financial process that had nothing to do with detergent or bleach. But as ridiculous as all of this seemed to Wheels, a couple of things about these bills did look like major clues. Leonard's money, even after the laundering process, was grouped together in 1s and 5s, like it would be in a cash register. In addition to that, Leonard had not been using some kind of code or metaphor when he said he found blood on his money, because even though these bills were faded, Wheels saw several brownish red spots that he believed were bloodstains. To Wheels, this looked like it had to be the money stolen from the cash box that Debbie brought home from the store, and he assumed the blood on the bills either belonged to Debbie or the killer. Leonard must have sensed what Wheels was thinking because he got really jittery and blurted out that this was not his money. He had gotten it from another drug addict that he knew. Agent Wheels chose not to flip the switch in his demeanor. He stayed totally calm and said to Leonard, "Boy, that sounds like a pretty convenient excuse." But Leonard swore he was telling the truth, and he even told Wheels the name of this other drug addict. Wheels said he'd look into it, but he told Leonard he better not leave town. Wheels confiscated Leonard's cash, bagged it as evidence, and brought it to the county sheriff's station. Over the next few days, Wheels and his team dug into the background of this other drug addict that Leonard had mentioned, and then Wheels brought them in for an interview. At first, when Wheels asked about the night of the murders, he felt like he'd been right about Leonard lying. This interview was not going anywhere. But Wheels shifted his focus, and the interview suddenly took a complete turn. Because when Wheels brought up the money with the blood on it, this drug addict shouted, "That money you got from Leonard? That's my goddamn money!" Wheels just sat there, He couldn't even think of what to say next. He had dealt with a lot of different types of criminals over his career, but he had never heard a suspect just shout out something so potentially damning before. After the interview was over, Wheels let the drug addict go, but he quickly secured a search warrant for the addict's house, and he had the addict's car impounded. And when forensics experts searched the car, they found a faded bloody fingerprint on the driver's side door handle. The sample was sent off to the state lab for testing, and this time the lab expedited the test. So on July 26th, a little over a month after the murders, Agent Wheels got back those test results, along with the results from the initial DNA samples taken from the house. And Wheels knew he had found Billy and Debbie's killer. Based on DNA testing, interviews, and evidence found throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what state police believe happened to Billy and Debbie Triplett on June 19, 2001. That night, the killer quietly walked into Billy and Debbie's kitchen. They could hear the Braves game coming from the TV in the family room. The killer opened a drawer and pulled out a sharp knife. They carefully slid the knife into their back pocket and then walked into the family room. Billy sat up on the couch, and the killer immediately started shouting at him. Billy shouted back and was about to get off the couch, but the killer ran across the room and leapt on top of him. They struggled, but the killer pinned Billy down and without even looking, grabbed something heavy off the coffee table and started wildly slamming it into the side of Billy's head. Blood sprayed on the walls and all over the couch as Billy stopped moving. The killer got up, drew the knife from their pocket, grabbed Billy, and slit his throat. But the killer didn't stop. They kept digging the knife deeper into Billy's neck until they had almost decapitated him. Finally, the killer stepped back, walked away, and went to the kitchen. They washed the knife off, rinsed their hands and face, and set out some cleaning supplies. Then they picked the knife back up, went to the family room, sat down, and waited while the baseball game kept playing on TV. At 10 p.m., a few hours after the killer had arrived at the house, they heard a car pull up outside. They quickly turned off the TV and ran toward the front of the house, carrying the knife and the blunt object they'd attacked Billy with. They flipped off the light in the entryway and crouched down against the wall not far from the door. The killer heard footsteps just outside, and they clutched the knife tight. The door unlocked, and the killer saw it swing open. And before Debbie could even turn on the light or call to her husband, the killer leapt out of the darkness, grabbed her, slammed the blunt object into her head, and cut her throat too. Debbie's body collapsed just inside the door. The killer flipped on the light, put the knife back in their pocket, and grabbed Debbie's purse. They took out Debbie's car keys, and they saw a tube of lipstick. They walked into the family room, and with the lipstick, they scrawled the word "narc" on the wall over Billy's body. After that, they walked through the house, got the cleaning supplies they'd laid out in the kitchen, and then stepped over Debbie's body and went outside to her minivan. The killer opened the passenger door and saw the metal cash box on the floorboard. They found the key for the box on Debbie's keyring they'd stolen, opened the box, and stuffed the money from it into their pockets, getting blood from their hands all over the cash. The killer quickly wiped down the van with the cleaning supplies and tossed Debbie's keys onto the passenger seat. Then they ran to their car with their hands and pockets filled with cash, cleaning supplies, lipstick, and the murder weapons, and they drove straight home. The following morning, the killer woke up and saw several messages, but they ignored them and waited until later in the afternoon to go back to their parents' house. The bloody cash that Leonard had in his possession was the money from the cash box, but Leonard had told the truth. Another drug addict had given him that money. And this drug addict was Billy's son from his first marriage, Randy. And Randy was the killer. It turned out Randy's drug habit had been going on for years. He struggled to get work, and he almost never had any money. Billy had continually bailed his son out financially, but recently, Billy, and especially Debbie, had just had enough. and Billy had met with his son more than once to tell him they were cutting him off. On the night of the murder, Randy already felt angry and betrayed by Billy and Debbie, and so when he got to the house and saw his dad on the couch, he begged him to give him more money. But Billy said no way, he needed to get his act together and clean up his life. After that, Randy got the knife, argued with his dad again, and then attacked him on the couch with a blunt object, and then slit his throat. Hours later, Randy used the same weapons to kill Debbie. After murdering his dad and stepmom, Randy had the idea to try to make it look like a drug-related murder, so he wrote "narc" on the wall in lipstick. And he figured if that didn't work, police would assume this crime was connected to the earlier robbery at his parents' store. And Randy was right. Investigators focused on both of these theories. But during the investigation, Randy started to panic, and at one point, he literally tried to clean the blood off the cash he had stole in the laundry machine, but when that didn't work, he just gave the bloodstained cash to Leonard, assuming Leonard would hold on to it for him and keep quiet until the investigation died down. But Leonard called Agent Wheels and told him that Randy, who he'd known for a long time and who he did drugs with, was the person who gave him this money. Then, when Randy came in for questioning, he inexplicably shouted out that the blood-stained money was his. Wheels then moved in on Randy, his former Scholar Bowl rival, and had his car impounded. And the DNA sample that was taken from Randy's car door handle would match DNA samples from the crime scene. The blood belonged to Debbie, and Randy had just gotten some of it on his car after killing her. Randy was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But in 2016, he hanged himself in his prison cell. Michelle still thinks about her mother all the time, and she continually reminds people to hug the ones they love, because nobody, no matter how deep a connection they share, knows how much time they have together. In August of 2010, 19-year-old Mackenzie Hild hunched over her clipboard inside a large canvas tent in Rwanda. She had just finished her freshman year at Harvard University and was spending the summer working with HIV patients as a volunteer for a medical aid group. Mackenzie finished scribbling some patient notes onto her clipboard, then set it on a folding table alongside clipboards from other volunteers. She felt a little sad that the summer was coming to an end. While she was looking forward to going back to college, she'd never felt more fulfilled than over these past 3 months. Since childhood, she dreamed of working as a doctor in Africa. In fact, this was actually her second trip to the continent. She spent last summer working in a clinic in Uganda. She rubbed her eyes and then stretched and yawned, and as she did, she suddenly jerked in pain. There was a sharp cramp in her stomach, like someone had stabbed it with a knife. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, hoping the pressure would relieve the pain, but the cramping only got worse. It was not the first time this had happened. In fact, she'd had stomach cramps almost every day since she arrived in Rwanda a few months ago. Her stomach always started hurting shortly after she ate. It had gotten so bad that she was now skipping breakfast and eating as little as possible for lunch and dinner. The same thing had happened last summer in Uganda, too. She'd lost 15 pounds over 3 months. Luckily, once she got home, her weight went back to normal. So, despite being surrounded by doctors this summer, Mackenzie hadn't told anyone about her stomach pains. She figured they were just a side effect of her anti-malarial drugs. She'd be home in a few days, and the ache would go away, and she'd regain the weight she'd lost over the summer. So she took some deep breaths, riding out the pain until it subsided. Once she was feeling a bit better, Mackenzie stood up straight again. Then she went back to work and pushed the stomachache out of her mind. A few days later, Mackenzie's mom, Joanne Hild, stood with her husband Wayne in the Sacramento airport, about 65 miles from their home in Nevada City, California. Joanne was giddy with excitement. She hadn't seen Mackenzie in 3 months and couldn't wait to pull her daughter in for a big bear hug. But when Mackenzie finally walked through the doors, Joanne was shocked. Her daughter had lost a lot of weight. Mackenzie had always been thin, but now she looked downright skeletal. Joanne looked to Wayne, who seemed equally worried. He mumbled that she must have lost a good 20 or 30 pounds. Joanne agreed, but she forced herself to smile as her daughter saw them and came rushing over. That night, Joanne sat in the living room with her daughter and husband, watching Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. Joanne had ordered pizza for dinner, thinking that a few hearty meals would help Mackenzie put the weight back on. But as they sat together, eating and watching TV, Joanne couldn't help but notice that Mackenzie hardly touched her food. And when she did take a bite, she winced, like it had a bad taste or something. She asked her daughter about it, and Mackenzie explained she hadn't been eating much recently because her stomach hurt so badly after meals. She smiled and promised her mom she would eat more once the anti-malarial meds wore off. But Joanne didn't think that sounded right. Losing a little weight might be a side effect of anti-malarial medication, but pain so intense that her daughter was skipping meals? That had to be something else. She told Mackenzie they were going to go to the doctor first thing in the morning. Mackenzie nodded, now looking a bit scared. Joanne hadn't meant to upset her daughter, but she wasn't willing to wait to see what happened either. The next morning, Joanne sat with Mackenzie in the waiting room at the local clinic. They'd met with the doctor briefly, and he had ordered a full battery of tests, including tests for tropical diseases, HIV, and digestive disorders like Crohn's. Now they were waiting to see what the results might be. Joanne couldn't keep her legs still. She bounced them nervously, even when Mackenzie told her to stop. Deep down, Joanne was worried that something could be seriously wrong with her daughter. Thankfully, it was not long before the doctor popped her head into the waiting room and waved Mackenzie back. Joanne followed, and they stepped into the same little examination room where they'd first met the doctor. The doctor told Mackenzie that all of her tests had come back negative. In her opinion, it seemed like Mackenzie's system was just being sensitive to the food she'd been eating over the summer, which explained the stomach pain and the weight loss. Her stomach should settle down in the coming weeks, and then she could regain the weight. And so the doctor just advised some rest at home. Joanne felt incredibly relieved as she promised the doctor that she would heed the advice, she would get her daughter some rest and some good home-cooked meals. And Mackenzie nodded as well, agreeing to take it easy until school started later in the month. And with that, Joanne decided to put her worries aside and focus on enjoying some quality time with her daughter before she returned to college in Boston. A few weeks later, Mackenzie sat at a large table in a wood-paneled dining hall, having dinner with some friends. She was back at Harvard, enjoying the beginning of her sophomore year. But she was still dangerously underweight, and her stomach ached every time she took so much as a small bite of food. Determined to eat anyways, she shoved a little bit of pasta into her mouth, and she chewed it until it basically dissolved inside of her mouth, and then she swallowed. Then she braced herself. Sure enough, a few minutes later, that stabbing pain erupted in her stomach. A friend noticed Mackenzie go silent and asked if everything was okay. Mackenzie just nodded and said the pain would subside in a few minutes. But 10 minutes later, the pain was only getting worse. Breathless, Mackenzie asked her friend to walk her back to her dorm room. She wanted to go lie down. The friend agreed, and they made their way across the quad from the dining hall to her dorm room. Once there, Mackenzie crawled into her bed and just lay in a fetal position, waiting for the stabbing sensation to go away. But it didn't. She was in too much pain to move, and so she stayed in bed for hours, just watching reruns of Friends and holding her stomach. The pain would finally ease up, at which point she was able to sit upright. Mackenzie went to the bathroom to brush her teeth, then tried to get some sleep. 2 weeks later, Mackenzie was in the emergency room, holding her stomach in agony. After 2 weeks of near constant stabbing pain, Mackenzie had finally gone to the student health center on campus. But she had been so underweight when she arrived that the staff didn't think they'd be able to treat her. Instead, they called an ambulance to take her to the hospital where she was now. A doctor walked into the room and pulled up a stool so that she was sitting directly across from Mackenzie. And then she leaned in, looking as though she had some bad news. The doctor explained that Mackenzie weighed only 75 pounds, which was a life-threatening weight for someone who was 5 feet 3 inches tall. The doctor said it was a good thing that Mackenzie had gone to the student health clinic for help. She might not have made it much longer on her own. The thought was terrifying. Mackenzie could feel her heart start to race as the doctor ordered a full workup of tests and then promised they would get to the bottom of her pain. Mackenzie called her parents to let them know what was going on, and her mom said she'd booked the next flight out of Sacramento. Mackenzie wanted to tell her mom that she was overreacting, that everything would be fine, but for the first time since she got sick, she didn't know if that was even true. This thought made her eyes sting with tears, and she begged her mom to please hurry up. When the doctor returned a few hours later, she wasn't alone. There was a small medical team with her, who told Mackenzie they had her test results. Mackenzie braced herself, hoping for something definitive. Instead, the doctors explained that all of Mackenzie's tests had come back normal. Mackenzie was shocked. She certainly did not feel normal. But then the doctor went on. Because her tests were normal, it was likely her weight loss was due to a psychological issue, not a physical one. So instead of surgery or medication, they wanted to send her to an inpatient treatment center, specifically one that specialized in eating disorders. Mackenzie blinked. Sure, she had just heard the doctor wrong. She didn't have an eating disorder. In fact, she was desperately trying to eat. But the doctor just shook her head and said that while that might seem true, Mackenzie's extreme weight loss and the fact that she sometimes skipped meals altogether pointed to a diagnosis of anorexia. Mackenzie tried to keep herself together, to convince them that she only skipped meals because of the physical pain in her stomach, but the doctors were certain that she was just struggling with an eating disorder. An hour later, Mackenzie felt so relieved when her mother walked into her hospital room. She began crying and then started trying to explain what the doctors had said to her, because she knew her mother would believe her. She would set the doctors straight. Instead, her mom sat on the edge of the bed and told Mackenzie that the inpatient center was probably best. They had to trust the doctors. They knew what they were doing. Mackenzie felt overwhelmed as she realized what her mother was saying, that she would be going to the treatment facility in a matter of hours to have her mental health examined. A month later, Mackenzie sat at a metal lunch table with a nurse sitting nearby. Mackenzie forced herself to eat the food in front of her, even though every bite felt like molten iron hitting her stomach. She'd spent the past 4 weeks in a medical unit for people with eating disorders and had been observed at mealtimes like this one on a regular basis. She choked down as much food as she could handle, knowing that she was not going to be released until she gained back some of the weight she'd lost over the summer. Her stomach now hurt all the time, and not just when she was eating. It now hurt to walk, to sleep, to move, just to think it hurt. And the worst part was that everybody kept telling her it was all in her head. She felt unhinged and angry. Angry that her doctors didn't believe her. Angry that she was missing school to be in this medical unit. And angry that she was in too much pain to eat. She felt like she was going crazy. She finished the last bite of her oatmeal and dropped her spoon in triumph. The nurse told her she had done a great job, then followed her to the small office where Mackenzie weighed in every few days. She stepped on a digital scale, and the nurse took down her weight from a screen that Mackenzie couldn't see. Blind weigh-ins were clinic policy because they didn't want the patients thinking about how much they weighed. But Mackenzie wanted to know. She was praying that she'd managed to put more weight on. Her clothes had been fitting her better, which she hoped was a good sign. Mackenzie sighed with relief when the nurse looked at her weight on the screen and then told her that she should be proud of her efforts. Mackenzie's stomach was already aching from the oatmeal she'd just eaten, but she refused to show it. She would do anything to leave this place and return to school. And if that meant she had to bear down and hide the agony she suffered every time she swallowed food, well, that was fine. Five months later, in the spring of 2011, Mackenzie sat upright in a bed at a medical facility while a nurse took her vitals. Mackenzie's parents waited anxiously by her side. Thankfully, Mackenzie's weight had stabilized, which allowed her to move back home with her parents back in Nevada City. But eating was still extremely painful, and Mackenzie knew that if she didn't do something to fix it, her weight could plummet right back down again. So now, a doctor was about to insert a permanent feeding tube through Mackenzie's nose and down her throat. It was a radical idea, but Mackenzie's gastroenterologist thought it might help her maintain her weight. Nutrients would now bypass her hypersensitive stomach altogether and instead go directly to her small intestine. From now on, Mackenzie would have to navigate the world with a tube in her nose. But the doctor thought it might help her gut rest for a while and alleviate the pain, which could allow Mackenzie to go back to school. And to Mackenzie, that was worth the risk. The nurse finished taking her vitals, and a few minutes later, the doctor came in and got all the equipment ready. Mackenzie smiled at her parents as the doctor inserted the tube up her nose, down her esophagus, and into her small intestine. Her mom asked her how she was feeling. Mackenzie had to be honest. Not great. But at least she wasn't having stabbing pains in her stomach, and hopefully it would all be upwards from here. A few weeks later, Mackenzie arrived at her gastroenterologist's office for a routine checkup. She stepped on the scale, which flashed 105 pounds. It was phenomenal news. She'd officially regained all the weight she'd lost since first going to Rwanda. Mackenzie was overjoyed. And then it got even better when her gastroenterologist told her he was officially ruling out anorexia as a diagnosis, and he was approving Mackenzie to return to college in the fall. Now, the gastroenterologist was clear. They still didn't know what was causing Mackenzie so much pain, but at the very least, it didn't have to stop her from living her life. Mackenzie was too excited to care at that moment. She could not wait to get home and re-enroll at Harvard. In early September of 2011, Mackenzie sat in a dining hall with her friends for the first time in a year. She couldn't have been happier to be back on campus, even if it meant that she was now a year behind her classmates. Mackenzie was getting all of her food through the nasal feeding tube now, and while that normally didn't bother her, it was Taco Tuesday at the dining hall, and her stomach almost grumbled as she smelled the chili peppers and grilled onions. She didn't miss the stomach pain, but some days she really missed eating. And she also didn't like the feeling that everybody was always looking at her. She was the nose tube girl, and she felt even more conspicuous when she was sitting next to friends at the dining hall. So she took out a textbook, deciding to get a jump start on her homework while her friends ate. Their mouths were too full to talk anyway. Mackenzie had a full course load this semester, and she'd volunteered to work at a local homeless shelter. So really, she told herself, cutting out the time it took to actually eat meals was for the best. Just then, one of her friends asked her if she wanted to try just a little bit of the churros they were serving for dessert, and Mackenzie did. She really did. But she still shook her head no. She told her friend that she was enjoying her life and that really this was no big deal. But the friend frowned, not quite believing her, and then went back to eating. As for Mackenzie, she sighed and went back to her homework. The following summer, in July of 2012, Mackenzie stood in line at a burger shack outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was spending the summer volunteering again, this time on Native American reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. She was thrilled to be back in the field, and best of all, she no longer had a feeding tube coming out of her nose. She stepped up to the counter and handed the cashier a list of orders. She apologized for the large volume. The food was for a clinic full of hungry doctors waiting on burgers and chicken sandwiches. But none of this food was for Mackenzie. Even though she no longer had a nasal feeding tube, she still wasn't eating. That May, surgeons had given her a stomach feeding tube that was less conspicuous than the one in her nose. They'd also removed her gallbladder to avoid the risk of gallstones, hoping that would relieve her pain somewhat. But her new feeding tube delivered nutrition to her stomach, and so she was getting those stabbing stomach pains again, even now as she stood outside the burger shack. They weren't as bad or as prolonged as when she actually ate food, but still, it hurt. Mackenzie stood around the parking lot, waiting for her order to be up and checking her watch. She was waiting for a phone consultation with her gastroenterologist, who she still checked in with routinely, and today she had a special request. She wanted to know when she could go back to volunteering in Africa. She had gotten used to not eating, but she was tired of letting her stomach pain rule her life. She wanted clearance to go back overseas. Just then, Mackenzie picked up the burgers, and a few minutes later, her doctor called. Mackenzie updated him on how she was doing, and then she asked for clearance to go back to work in Africa. The doctor paused for a moment to think, and then finally he said yes. He thought it would be okay for her to go. Mackenzie was so happy. She thanked the doctor, hung up, and jumped in her car. As soon as she had a free moment, she would start making plans. Two years later, in the summer of 2014, Mackenzie's mom, Joanne, was on a hike with her husband, Wayne. It was a dry, hot day in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, and Joanne could see Wayne, who was a little ahead of her on the trail, pouring some of their water over his head to cool off. Joanne was lagging behind him because she was in deep conversation with a fellow hiker. She was telling her new friend about her daughter, and he was nodding his head as Joanne described Mackenzie's struggle to live a full life despite her illness. Because this fellow hiker, whom she just met, happened to be a doctor at the University of California at San Francisco who specialized in advocating for patients with complex medical cases. Joanne explained that Mackenzie was currently in South Africa, volunteering after she graduated from Harvard in May. Her doctors had been reluctant to let her go, but said if she really felt called to return to Africa, well, South Africa would be okay. The doctor that Joanne was talking to on the trail raised his eyebrows and admitted that he was impressed. Mackenzie sounded like a really special person. He asked if he and a medical student could contact Mackenzie. He was currently teaching a course on medical advocacy, and Mackenzie's case sounded like an ideal mystery to investigate. Joanne couldn't hide her excitement. For the first time in 5 years, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they would get some real answers here. The moment Joanne and Wayne got back to their car, Joanne texted her daughter in South Africa, telling her all about the chance encounter with this doctor. A few weeks later, a medical student named Jessica Gould sat next to the professor Joanne had met on the hiking trail. They were about to join a Skype call with Mackenzie. Jessica had been helping her professor look over Mackenzie's case and devise questions and theories that might guide their Skype call, and so she felt prepared for this. But in all honesty, Jessica was nervous. She had read how many specialists had worked with Mackenzie, and she didn't know what she, a fourth-year medical student, could offer. There was a ding on the computer, and Mackenzie appeared on the screen. She was thin, almost frail, and looked impossibly tired. And not from a bad night of sleep, but from years of exhaustion. Despite that, she was smiling and waving, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun on the top of her head. Jessica admired Mackenzie's determination. She hoped there was some way they could help her. She and her professor said hello, and the more they spoke with Mackenzie, the more inspired Jessica became by her. She thought about how Mackenzie approached her chronic illness. Despite her constant pain, Mackenzie still found ways to help others thousands of miles from home. And so if Mackenzie could find ways to help others, well, Jessica could find a way to help Mackenzie. Several months later, Jessica was sitting in front of her laptop, as always, feeling exhausted. She was on a phone call with her professor, explaining that she still hadn't figured out what was wrong with Mackenzie. She was frustrated. She'd spent nearly every minute of her free time chasing down leads, devouring thousands of pages of records from different hospitals, and searching through medical databases, anything that could help her find a way to help Mackenzie Hild. But every lead she chased met a dead end. It was maddening, and she told her professor as much. He just sighed and was silent for a long moment. Then, he suggested Jessica go back and look at the more common diseases that all of Mackenzie's specialists had ruled out. Maybe Jessica's fresh perspective would unearth some clue these specialists had missed. Jessica doubted that she would find something that the country's top doctors had overlooked, but she didn't have any other leads to pursue, so she agreed. A few weeks later, in January 2015, Mackenzie was lounging on the couch back home in Nevada City when her phone rang. When she answered, the man who spoke to her was Dr. Christopher Skelly, the chief of vascular surgery at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Dr. Skelly explained that before the holidays, he'd received an interesting email from a medical student named Jessica Gould. And after chatting with Jessica, he had agreed to review Mackenzie's case. And in his opinion, he knew what was causing Mackenzie's pain and had a way to treat it. Mackenzie's heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. For the past 6 years, she'd either been living in excruciating pain or with a feeding tube up her nose or in her stomach. It had been 5 years since she last chewed food or even tasted it. She thought this was how she would live the rest of her life. She'd grieved, she'd processed, she'd found a way to move on. And now she was hearing that there might be a cure. She told Dr. Skelly that she couldn't book her ticket to Chicago quickly enough. 4 weeks later, Mackenzie arrived at Dr. Skelly's office feeling nervous and thrilled. After some testing, Dr. Skelly told Mackenzie that he believed her symptoms were physical, not psychological. In fact, he believed she had been suffering for years because of a physical abnormality that she'd had since birth. And the tests proved it. Just hearing those words flooded Mackenzie with relief. She wanted to cry. Then Dr. Skelly finally gave her an official diagnosis. He said that Mackenzie had a rare and little-known condition called median arcuate ligament syndrome, or MALS for short. He explained that the median arcuate ligament is a band of tissue that runs from the base of the diaphragm, the muscles that help us breathe, up to the heart. For people with MALS, that band of tissue is in the wrong place. It crosses over the heart and compresses the artery that supplies blood to the stomach and other organs. This impaired blood flow can cause intense pain when eating because the stomach isn't getting the blood supply it needs to digest the food. Doctors had actually tested Mackenzie for MALS early on, but those results came back negative. However, when Jessica went back and reviewed the early decisions in Mackenzie's case, she thought MALS perfectly explained Mackenzie's symptoms. And so Jessica had convinced a leading expert on malls, Dr. Skelly, to investigate whether her hunch was right. And when he did, Dr. Skelly determined that the previous tests were wrong. Mackenzie did have malls after all. On March 18, 2015, Dr. Skelly performed a 2.5-hour surgery on Mackenzie to relieve the pressure on the artery supplying blood to her stomach. The next day, when Mackenzie woke up, she had her first bite of food in 5 years, a spoonful of scrambled eggs from the hospital cafeteria. She chewed, she swallowed, and then she waited, and no pain came, and she burst into tears of joy. It would take a few weeks for her stomach to get used to eating, but the pain never did come back. After recovering from Mall syndrome, Mackenzie went on to attend medical school at the University of Washington in Seattle. At around 1 a.m. on August 27, 2000, a fisherman named Sam Watts did his best to keep his balance on the wet deck of the huge commercial fishing boat that he was working on. And as he tried to do that, he looked over at his crewmate, Michael Edwards, another fisherman, who was grabbing onto the mast as the ship rocked underneath their feet. Sam and Michael and the 4 other crew members on board this boat had just dropped their anchor 56 miles off the northeast coast of Queensland, Australia, and up until about an hour earlier, the sea had been very calm. But now, this huge storm had rolled in, the wind had picked up, the waves were huge, and while the 4 other crew members had already gone below to try to catch some sleep, Sam and Michael were now on the deck, doing their best to try to secure everything before they went down below. And so as the wind is whipping and the waves are smashing against the side of this boat, Sam and Michael decide they should split up to work more efficiently, where Sam will go to the front of the boat, and Michael will go to the back of the boat, and they would each kind of work towards the middle of the boat, checking all the fastenings and the knots to make sure everything was good. And then when they reached the center, they would be good, and they could go down below. And so they did that. Sam went to the front, Michael to the back, and as they began to work, they kept constant eye contact with each other because this was obviously a very dangerous thing they were doing. But at some point, as Sam was making his way, he had to duck down to check a particular fastening. And so when he ducked down, he lost sight of Michael just for a second. But in that split second, this huge rogue wave smashed the side of the boat, practically capsizing it, sending Sam flying towards the railing. But Sam luckily grabbed onto the railing before being thrown into the water. And then as the boat kind of began to rock back to level, Sam instinctively looked back down the ship to look for Michael. And he watched through the darkness and the rain as Michael went careening off the side into the ocean. He hadn't been able to grab onto anything. And so the instant the boat kind of leveled out again, Sam screamed for Michael, but he couldn't see him. And so he ran down below, woke up the whole crew. And so moments later, the crew was on the deck. They had their big spotlights out, scanning the water, through this big storm, looking for signs of Michael. And at the same time, the captain had come up and he was on the radio talking to police. And so several minutes later, a police boat managed to come out to the fishing boat. And at the same time, the crew is still desperately looking for Michael. They haven't found him yet. And now the police began circling around the whole area, calling out for Michael, throwing out buoys into the water in hopes of, maybe Michael sees one and grabs hold. But nobody could find Michael. He was just gone. And so all that morning into the early afternoon, the police continued to look in the area for Michael. The crew on board the fishing boat did the same thing, but still nobody could find a trace of Michael. And so around noon that day, the search was called off. And the police told Sam and the rest of the crew of this fishing boat that unfortunately, at this point, it seemed very likely that Michael had drowned. And so, of course, Sam and the rest of the crew were basically in shock. I mean, this happened so quickly. How could it be that, Michael just a few hours ago was joking around with them, part of the crew, and now he's dead? I mean, it was just unbelievable. But now, unfortunately, Sam and the rest of the crew had to basically put their grief aside and make a very practical, albeit very cold, decision, which was, even though Michael's dead, do we stay out here and continue fishing? Or because of his death, do we just go back home? And you might think that decision was actually super easy to make, that of course, they would pack it in and go back home. How could you possibly stay out here and go fishing considering what had happened? But you need to understand it cost a lot of money to go out on these fishing excursions, and they had just left, and so they had not caught anything. So they had spent all this money and they had no return from it. And these fishermen were not wealthy. In fact, honestly, they needed the money from this trip just to provide for their families. And so if they did turn around right now, it would really hurt all of them, and it would also make it really hard to get the funding again to go out later. And so after some pretty awkward deliberation, the crew decided that, you know what, we got to stay out here and fish. But the silver lining was, hey, if we stay out here for another day or so, maybe Michael's body will float to the surface and we can at least recover him and bring him back home to his family. And so all day that day, the fishermen stayed out and fished, and they were very successful. One after another, they were catching these cod that were 6 feet long and nearly 100 pounds. They're called flowery cods. But despite how incredible this was for their business, this was not a cause for celebration because they had just lost their friend the day before. And so it was a very somber day. And all day, all the fishermen really are looking out at the water, hoping to see Michael's body. But, by the end of that 24 hours of fishing, they didn't see any sign of Michael. And so they packed everything in and they headed back to port. They sold off all of their cod that they had bought. And then each of the fishermen went back to their families and grieved the loss of their friend. A few days later, a factory worker was standing in front of a fish processing line with this huge 97-pound cod right in front of them. This is one of the flowery cods that Sam and the other fishermen had caught 24 hours after their friend had gone overboard. And so this worker took their knife and, like they did every day all day long, began opening up this fish. And at some point, after cutting it open and looking inside of this enormous cod, the worker just stopped and couldn't believe what they were seeing, and then they began to scream. It would turn out a few days earlier, after Michael had been thrown overboard during that storm, he very likely had been alive when he hit the water. But the area where they were fishing off the coast of Queensland, Australia, was known for having lots of sharks and saltwater crocodiles in the area. And so pretty much immediately, Michael was attacked by either a shark or a crocodile, or maybe both. And during this feeding frenzy, as Michael's getting ripped to pieces, his head got ripped off and began to float away. And at some point, one of those huge flowery cods saw the head and ate it whole. And then later that day, Michael's colleagues caught the cod who caught Michael's head. And so that factory worker who opened up that particular cod saw Michael's undigested head looking up at her, and apparently his face was fixed in terror with his eyes wide and his mouth open as if his final moment had been him screaming. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Gray Blanket. At around 1 a.m. on March 1st, 1954, a 20-year-old fisherman named Oishi Matashishi finally headed down to his bed on the lower deck of the fishing boat that he worked on, which was called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. Oishi was totally exhausted. He and the other 22 crew members had been working practically around the clock, 18-hour days for the last 6 weeks, trying to catch tuna, but so far, this trip had really been a disaster. They had gotten stranded on sandbars, there had been these terrible storms that had nearly capsized the boat, and then also they had lost a lot of their fishing lines when they got snagged on coral reefs. And so, as a result, their tuna hauls so far had been devastatingly low. And Oishi and the rest of the crew were very aware of this. In fact, Oishi was very worried that he would not bring home enough money to support his family. Back when Oishi was 14 years old, his father, who had been the breadwinner for their family, had been crushed to death when he was repairing a ship. And so now Oishi had stepped into that patriarch role, taking care of his mother and his 5 other siblings. And so Oishi really needed a solid paycheck from this trip, and it wasn't looking like that was going to happen. And so Oishi staggered his way into his small room and he collapsed onto his bed, and as he lay there trying to sleep, he felt the ship gently rocking side to side. The ship, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was anchored relatively close to the Marshall Islands, which is a strip of islands right about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. But what's unique about the Marshall Islands is they sit over these huge ancient underwater volcanoes. Now, these volcanoes are dormant, but the captain of the Lucky Dragon number 5 was weary enough about getting too close to these dormant volcanoes in fear they might erupt, that he intentionally kept them about 80 miles or so away from the Marshall Islands. And so eventually, Oishi did drift off to sleep in his bunk. But 5 hours later, Oishi suddenly sat up wide awake because the little room he was in was now completely flooded with this very bright yellowy light. And so Oishi, he's kind of confused. He felt like it was too early for sunrise, and he checked his watch and he saw it was only 6:45 a.m. And so yes, it was too early for sunrise. So whatever this was, it was not the sun. And then when he went to the little porthole window where all this light was coming in, he had to squint his eyes, but he looked outside and he couldn't tell where this light was really coming from or what it was. But he could clearly see it was coming from the west, and the sun rises in the east. So really, whatever this light was, it was not the sun. At the same time, the rest of Oishi's crewmates who were in this room with him, they were also starting to wake up and kind of looking around like, what's going on here? And then without even saying anything, all of them just rushed out of the room and ran upstairs to the top deck to look around and see what was going on. And when they got up there, Oishi looked out towards the west where these lights were up in the sky, and he couldn't really see a clear point of origin. It wasn't like there was an obvious thing creating these lights. It was more like the western sky was just unbelievably bright and yellow and orange, and it seemed like the light was kind of hovering over where the Marshall Islands would be. And so everyone's thinking, is it possible this is a volcano eruption? Is there something else going on here? And then as the crew is just watching in stunned silence at all these crazy lights in the sky, the lights kind of began to fade and they turned blue and purple, and then they just went away and the entire crew was pitched back into darkness. And as everyone's just standing around having no idea what to make of these lights, the oldest crew member on board, who was 40 years old, he said the one thing that everybody kind of in the back of their mind was thinking about but didn't want to say. The oldest crew member just said, "Atomic bomb." Just 9 years earlier, the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. Now, Oishi, who was Japanese, he was 11 years old at the time this happened, and it had a profound impact on his life and his family's lives, his friends. Anybody who was alive when this happened, it changed everything. But as Oishi and the rest of his crew were kind of staring out to the west, which was all dark at this point, Oishi thought, there's no way this could have been an atomic bomb. Number one, World War II is over, so there's no reason a bomb would get dropped again. And 2, when those atomic bombs were dropped on Japan 9 years earlier, it vaporized basically everything and everyone in its path. And so for them to be this close to these huge lights, if that were an atomic bomb, wouldn't they too be vaporized? Like they would not be able to see that and live. And so Oishi began to tell himself, okay, it probably was not a volcano eruption. It probably was not an atomic bomb. I don't know what it was, but we're okay. And while many of the other people on board the ship felt the same way Oishi did, very quickly the call came out amongst the crew to just go ahead and bring in the lines right now. We don't know what these lights were, but we need to head back to port back in Yaizu, Japan. And so quickly, Oishi and the rest of the crew got to work pulling these lines in and prepping the boat to head back to port. And then at some point after Oishi had done what he was supposed to do, he began walking his way down below to the galley to get some food. But when Oishi was about halfway, he suddenly heard this deafening explosion outside coming from the west where these lights had been, and immediately Oishi just jumped onto the ground, covering his head, thinking that was going to protect him. And as he's laying there listening to this unbelievable exploding sound, he's thinking, oh my gosh, one of those volcanoes under the Marshall Islands has indeed erupted. That's what's happening. And any minute now, a giant tsunami wave from this eruption is going to flip us over. We're going to get killed here. And so Oishi, as this massive exploding sound is going on, he jumps to his feet and he runs upstairs and he finds the majority of the crew that was still up there had jumped to the ground and they were just kind of protecting themselves. A couple braver crew members had stood up and were kind of looking out towards the west to see if they could see what was going on. But there were no lights now. It was just these crazy loud exploding sounds coming from the west. And then suddenly all the sound stopped, and Oishi and the crew at that point braced for what they believed was this inevitable tsunami wave that was going to hit them.
But the weird thing is after the exploding sound stopped, everything was totally calm. In fact, Oishi glanced over the edge of the boat and he saw the water was totally placid, more calm than normal. And after a few more minutes went by and no massive tsunami wiped them all out, the crew was like, what's going on here? And so as Oishi and the rest of the terrified crew on deck began exchanging wild theories about what these lights and these sounds could have been, ranging from, again, the volcano or maybe an atomic bomb, or some said maybe an asteroid hit the Earth. And as they're doing that, the ship captain called out again, hey, finish pulling in the lines. We need to get out of here right now. We don't know what that was. We don't know what's coming next. We gotta go. Now, for reference, pulling in these lines was not as simple as it sounded. It was kind of a long and complicated process. And so Oishi and the rest of the crew, they began doing their best to pull these lines in as quickly as they could. But when the sun finally rose in the east, the crew on board the Lucky Dragon number 5, as they looked out towards the west, towards the Marshall Islands, they began to notice these weird gray clouds forming over these islands. And as the crew began to talk about these strange-looking clouds, they noticed that despite the wind blowing from east to west, these clouds, these weird clouds over the islands, were actually making their way towards them. Basically, they were moving against the wind, which made no sense. And so as these clouds got closer and closer, the ship captain was screaming at Oishi and the others to hurry up, get these lines in, we gotta go, we don't want to wait for this cloud. But it just was taking so long to pull in these lines, and before long, these weird gray clouds had moved directly over them and blocked out the sun. It was like it was nighttime all over again. And as soon as these clouds were right above them, Oishi and the others, they just stopped and looked up. And suddenly it started to rain. Except not normal rain. It was like this weird milky substance, like gray milky color, and it was also hot. And so Oishi put his hands out and he cupped all this weird liquid in his hands, and nobody knew what it was. And then before long, the rain turned into sleet, still kind of gray and milky, and then the sleet turned into what looked like snow. And so Oishi and the others, they had their hands out still, and they were catching these weird snowflakes, but they didn't melt in their hands. They just kind of pooled on their hand and just sat there. Now, Oishi and the others were definitely unsettled by the snow, and frankly by everything that had happened that morning. They really did not understand what was going on, but there was something kind of incredible about this weird substance that was coming out of the sky. To the point where many of the fishermen on board grabbed bags and saved some of this weird mushy snow stuff to bring back home, to maybe show their families and friends, or even to give to science to see if maybe they could study it and see what it was. And so after Oishi and the rest of the crew had kind of gotten over the novelty of this weird snow coming out of the sky, they just got right back to work pulling in these lines. And the whole time, remember, they're getting dumped on by this weird stuff that's not melting, and it's building up on the deck to the point where they have to stop what they're doing and shovel this stuff off the deck just to continue pulling in the lines. And for hours and hours they did that, just under this weird snowstorm. And then finally, right around noon, all the lines had been pulled in, and the ship's captain turned the wheel, and they began heading towards port. The next morning, Oishi woke up inside of his bunk on board the Lucky Dragon number 5. It would take several days to make it all the way back to port. And when Oishi woke up, he was suddenly struck with this intense nausea. And so he got up and stumbled his way into the bathroom, and just kind of out of instinct, he grabbed his toothbrush and began brushing his teeth. And as he did this, he had this weird feeling that his teeth felt like they were loose, that if he brushed too hard with his toothbrush, that he could knock his teeth clear out of his jaw. And then when Oishi spit into the sink, he saw there was all this blood. And so Oishi began to panic, and he opened up his mouth and he stared in the mirror to see if maybe he had lost some teeth. But his teeth looked okay. But again, everything felt wrong, and he felt so sick. And so Oishi, he left the bathroom and went upstairs to the top deck. And when he got up there, he saw many of the other members of the crew, and they looked terrible. Their skin was a weird gray color, and some of them had blisters all over their skin. And so to Oishi and to the other crew members, it now seemed kind of obvious that whatever was coming out of the sky, that weird milky substance and that weird snow that didn't melt, Clearly it must be toxic in some way, or maybe it's led to some horrible allergic reaction. And so Oishi and the others began referring to the stuff that came out of the sky as death ash. And the fishermen who had gathered up a lot of this death ash into bags to bring back home were now too scared to even touch the bags. Like, they wanted to take the bags and dump the contents overboard, but the fear of interacting with that weird death ash was too much. And so there were these bags kind of draped all over the ship that nobody went near that contained this stuff. And over the next few days that the Lucky Dragon number 5 continued its journey towards port, Oishi and the rest of the crew members continued to get sicker and sicker. In fact, on one day, Oishi was outside unfurling one of the sails, and as he was hoisting this rope, he noticed the rope was covered in blood, and then when he looked at his hands, he realized it was because his hands were basically disintegrating as he was touching the rope, like his skin was just falling apart. And then, in addition to his skin falling off, Oishi's hair began falling out in huge clumps. And he was not alone. Many of the other crew members on board the Lucky Dragon number 5 had the same things going on. It was like everybody was just totally deteriorating, and they all knew it had to be connected to whatever the heck they had heard and seen when there was that explosion and the lights and the stuff raining out of the sky. They didn't know what it was, but it could not be a coincidence. That happened, and now this was happening to them. And so finally, on March 14th, the crew of the Lucky Dragon number 5 pulled into port in Yaizu, Japan, and as they got off, they made this interesting decision to not tell anyone what happened to them. They all had this fear that, if it got out, that people knew what happened to them, that somehow they'd get in trouble. And so they all decided they would treat whatever was happening to them, but they would do it kind of secretly. And so Oishi, as soon as he left the boat, he went straight to the doctor's office, and as best as he could, he tried to kind of discreetly tell the doctor what had happened during this fishing trip. And then he showed the doctor all these lesions on his skin and the bald spots and the fact that he was so sick and that his teeth felt loose. And the doctor's like, I got no idea what's wrong with you. And so all he did was prescribe Oishi some zinc ointment to put on all of these blisters and lesions on his skin. And he told Oishi that, this should work. It should clear everything up and you should be okay. But, come back if this ointment doesn't work. A few hours later, a woman was inside of her home in the port city of Yaizu, right near where the Lucky Dragon number 5 had docked, when she heard a knock on her front door. And so she put her broom up against the wall, she walked to the front door, she opened it up, and standing right outside was this horrible looking man who had gray skin and lesions all over him and all these bald spots, and he was smiling and his teeth were all red like there was blood all over his teeth. And for a second she thought about slamming the door, but then she looked more closely and she realized it was her neighbor, Oishi. As soon as she realized this, she said, Oishi, what happened to you? And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders like he didn't have a way to explain all of this. And then he held out a small gray package and he just said, here's some extra fish that we caught on the last fishing trip I was on. I just wanted to give it to you. And the woman, who was still totally caught off guard by how terrible Oishi looked, she just turned and pointed at her kitchen table, telling Oishi to put the fish on the table. And so Oishi came inside and limped his way into the kitchen and put the package down. And then when he turned to leave, the woman stopped him and she said, Oishi, tell me what's going on here. You look horrible. You have all these bloody bandages on you. Was there a fire on the boat? Was there some sort of accident? Tell me. And so Oishi, he looked down for a second and then he looked back at her and said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Because again, remember, Oishi and the rest of the crew had decided they were not going to share details of what happened. And so this woman, who really liked Oishi and wanted to make sure he was okay, she just said, okay, you don't got to tell me about it, but here, have a seat. We'll catch up about other things. And so Oishi, he nodded and took a seat inside the living room. And as he sat there, the woman went into the kitchen and she got a cup of water. She brought it back and she handed it to him. And Oishi, he took the cup with a trembling hand and he sat there drinking his water, just looking so terrible. And the woman, she really didn't know what to say. She did not understand at all what was happening. But she could tell, Oishi does not want to talk about it. And so to kind of break up the silence, she just began talking about stuff she had heard on the news. And the big news story that everybody was talking about was the science experiment that was done out near the Marshall Islands. And when this woman talked about a science experiment and the Marshall Islands, Oishi dropped his glass and it shattered on the ground, and he just stared at this woman with a look of absolute terror on his face. And at this point, Oishi decided he was not going to keep his story secret anymore, and so he told his neighbor what had happened out on the water, the explosions, the lights, the rain, the snow, all of it. And after he did, the woman became terrified and said, "Get out of my house, go, go, go." And so Oishi, he got up and he kind of ran out of the house, not really sure what was going on. And then the woman, after Oishi was gone, she turned and she realized the package of fish that Oishi had left was sitting inside of her kitchen. And so she screamed and she too ran out the door. Over the next few days, more and more of the fishermen from the Lucky Dragon number 5 began to talk about what had happened out on the water, and as those stories began to circulate, they began to make the news all over the world. And as this happened, fish markets all over Japan had to shut down and destroy thousands and thousands of pounds of fish in fear that it might have come from the Lucky Dragon number 5. And the reason why everybody was so scared of coming in contact with anything that had been on board the Lucky Dragon, whether it was the fish or the people, is because on March 1st, 1954, when Oishi was suddenly woken up by the bright light outside coming from the west, and then there was that loud explosion, and then the cloud and the rain and the snow, all of that was not a volcano, it was not an atomic bomb, it was not a meteorite, it was not a fire, it was that science experiment that was talked about on the news. The US military was testing a brand new weapon that is quite possibly the most lethal weapon ever made. It's called a hydrogen bomb, and for reference, hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than atomic bombs. Now, they detonated this hydrogen bomb far away from all of civilization. However, the Lucky Dragon number 5 was just close enough to this explosion that the crew on board the ship became the first humans in history to experience something called fallout, which is when deadly radioactive particles from this explosion get thrown up into the sky from the blast, and then they rain down on you like snow. That weird material they were feeling that they called death ash, that's the fallout. It's all radioactive. And in fact, the actual material itself that was raining down on them was coral reefs. They had basically been liquefied from this hydrogen blast. They got shot up into the sky, and then that's what fell down on them. That's why it wasn't melting. It was coral reefs. And so the reason Oishi and the rest of the crew got so sick and their skin began falling off and their hair began falling off was because of their contact with this fallout, this death ash. And so once they began sharing their story of what happened out there and it began making the news, the crew of the Lucky Dragon was rounded up and sent to a special medical facility where they were quarantined, and unbelievably, only one of them died. He was the oldest crew member who had brought up that maybe the lights they had just seen was an atomic bomb. But even though the rest of the crew survived, they would spend the rest of their lives battling strange diseases and cancers, and many of them would become sterilized, and those that weren't, their children often had birth defects. As for Oishi, he gave up being a fisherman and instead became a dry cleaner, but he wound up spending the bulk of the rest of his life being an anti-bomb advocate and author until his death in 2021, when he would pass away at the age of 87.
On the morning of August 7th, 1981, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer named Carl McCunn stood on the edge of a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and chucked a box of ammunition into the water. The splash it made was surprisingly loud in the total silence that surrounded him. Carl was on the last day of a 5-month-long solo camping trip in a very remote area of northern Alaska that was actually inside the Arctic Circle. A plane had dropped him off here in early spring, and he had set up his tent by this lake, which was surrounded on all sides by forest and huge snowy mountains. And during this 5-month trip, Carl had not seen or spoken to another person the entire time. There were no phones, no roads, no rangers, no people around for at least 100 miles. I mean, this is true isolation. Carl looked up into the sky and listened carefully for the low roar of the plane that was supposed to pick him up today. But as he listened, he couldn't hear anything. But this didn't worry Carl, because he actually had only arranged for his pickup date, not the pickup time. So it was just at some point on this day he was going to get picked up. He didn't know exactly when. And so as he anxiously waited, he just kind of puttered around his campsite and continued to pack up his things. And as Carl did this, he remembered that the type of plane that was going to be picking him up today, it was his buddy Rory's plane, it was really small. And there was a chance that he couldn't actually fit all of his belongings on the plane. And so in anticipation of this, he had identified that he didn't need all of his ammo. And so that's why he was chucking his ammo into the lake, basically in preparation for pickup. Just then, a breeze kicked up, and so Carl zipped his parka up to his chin. This was actually the so-called warm season in the Arctic Circle, but warm in the Arctic Circle meant still near freezing temperatures at night. And as much as Carl loved being out in the wilderness, doing these solo camping trips out in the middle of nowhere, he really was excited to get back to his home in Anchorage, Alaska, and see his friends and call his dad and, be in a nice warm house for once. Carl was about to chuck his 6th and final box of ammunition into the lake when he heard the loud sound of a wolf howling on the other side of the lake. And it made him stop for a second, and he decided that, maybe until the plane gets here, I'll hold on to at least 1 box of ammunition. So he stuck this final box into his bag, he picked it up, and then he walked along the shoreline up to where he had rigged a net to catch some fish. And when he got to the net, he saw he had caught 2 trout. And so he scooped the fish out, he went back to his campsite, he made a fire, cooked the fish, and as he sat down to eat them, he just kept looking up to the sky and listening, hoping for this plane to arrive soon. When he was done eating, Carl made a quick entry into his diary, kind of detailing the last day at camp, and then he finished packing up all his stuff, and he brought it all down to the waterline, ready to be picked up, and then he sat on his trunk, again, just kind of waiting for his friend to show up. And by this time, it was about mid-afternoon, and still no sign of the plane. But nonetheless, Carl sat there kind of taking in the scene, this beautiful lake and nature. This is the last time he's going to be here, and so he's trying to appreciate it. After all, this had been a really successful photography trip. He had shot 500 rolls of film that he knew he could sell, and that would make enough money that he'd be able to do this again the following year. And so as Carl sat there taking in the scene and daydreaming about next year's trip, he noticed the sun was beginning to set. And when he noticed this was kind of like the first time that Carl actually became worried. This far north, the sun stayed out for nearly 20 hours a day in the summer. And so if the sun was setting right now, that meant it had to be near midnight. And so his friend Rory, who was supposed to pick him up today, at some point today, well, now that we've hit midnight, Carl knew his friend had officially missed the date. And Carl had no way of contacting him to see what had happened or when he would be here. And so as dusk fell, and still there was no sign of Rory, Carl continued to get more and more anxious. And finally, he had to reset up his tent, and he crawled inside, got in a sleeping bag, and went to sleep praying that his friend would be there the next day. The next day, Carl got up early and packed up his stuff and waited by the shoreline for his friend, but all day he waited, and the plane still never came. Carl tried to convince himself that, maybe his friend got mixed up on the dates, or, maybe something came up that's delayed him a couple of days, but he'll be here. But then another day came and went, and then another, and still no plane. And it was around this time that Carl remembered something that made him feel sick to his stomach. On the night 6 months earlier, when he and Rory had discussed pickup plans, Carl remembered that night had been filled with drinking. These guys were just laughing and having a good time. And at some point, as the beers were flowing, Carl had asked Rory, "Hey, can you pick me up on August 7th at the end of my trip?" And Rory had said, "Yeah, I can probably do that." But Rory had also said that he would have to check his schedule first before he could 100% commit to this. And Carl, in his excitement about going on this trip and getting ready for it and all that, had just forgotten to follow up with Rory and make absolutely sure he could pick him up. And so now Carl was realizing that Rory wasn't delayed or mixed up about the dates. Rory wasn't coming. And Carl knew there was zero chance of another plane just happening to fly over the area and that plane picking him up. For the entire summer Carl had been out here, he had literally not seen any planes. His best hope was that his dad or maybe one of his friends would report him missing. But he knew that was unlikely, and it actually was his own doing. Carl traveled constantly and almost never told people where he was going or when he'd be back. And on one trip recently, Carl had gone out and missed his return date, and his dad had been concerned about him and so called the police. And when Carl had come back and realized what his dad did, he told his dad to never do that again. "Never contact authorities if I'm late. I'm fine." And all of this meant now Carl was going to face a brutal Alaskan winter all by himself with limited supplies and only a single box of ammunition. A few weeks later, at the end of August, Carl was still stuck out in the Alaskan wilderness. By now, Carl had fully accepted that Rory was not going to come pick him up, and Carl was doing his best not to fixate on his stupid mistake. He figured he had two choices. The first one was that he could just stay put and hope to be rescued. This was the conservative option. He knew how to get food and also firewood near his campsite, so he wouldn't starve to death and he wouldn't freeze. But this would only keep him alive. This would not actually get him rescued. The other choice was that Carl could pack up his campsite and attempt to basically hike out of here 75 miles to the nearest city, called Fort Yukon. Now, this could get him home, but with it came a much higher chance of death. If Carl did the hike, well, those 75 miles would be over extremely rough terrain with absolutely zero human-made trails. And so one little slip up and he could fall and get hurt or get lost. And also finding food was sort of a toss-up, and the weather at best would be brutal and at worst would be fatal. Plus, the entire region those 75 miles were in was absolutely teeming with wolves. Carl knew both of these choices were bad. But he was running out of time to make a decision. The brutal Arctic winter was fast approaching, and if Carl was going to attempt this horrible hike, he would really have to do it soon. And so as Carl thought about what he was going to do, he trudged his way over to one of his rabbit snares, and he was so happy to see he had caught a rabbit. And so he took the rabbit back to his camp and he cooked it over the fire. And as he's eating it, he's thinking, you know what, this isn't so bad. I caught food for now. I mean, this will keep me alive at least for a couple of days. You know, maybe I should just stay here. But deep down, he knew the staying put option was not a real option. I mean, even though, yes, by staying here, he could keep himself from starving. You know, he knew how to get food and all that. Well, he'd still be a sitting duck for all the predators in the area, and there were many, and remember, he only has one box of ammunition. But just then, Carl heard the most glorious sound, the distant whine of a small plane engine. At first, he thought he must be hearing things. Remember, he has not seen a plane at all since he got here. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky, and a second later, he saw a plane flying directly towards his camp, low and slow. Carl ran in his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he could find, his sleeping bag, which was bright orange. He ran outside of his tent and began waving it back and forth to get the pilot's attention. Carl saw the plane belonged to the Alaska State Troopers, and so he figured his friends must have reported him missing, and now the police were out to rescue him. A moment later, the plane passed directly over Carl's camp, so low to the ground that Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him. Carl looked right at the pilot's eyes, and when Carl was nearly certain he had just made eye contact with the pilot, he threw his fist up in the air in excitement and jumped up and down. He couldn't believe it. He was saved. The pilot was going to land and take him home. With a big grin on his face, Carl watched as this plane, sure enough, made a big U-turn. And then Carl watched the plane make another pass over the camp, low and slow, which Carl figured meant, the pilot was looking for a place to land. And so as the pilot was doing that, Carl rushed to his campsite and began packing everything up. And as he did, he's kind of keeping an eye out, watching the plane, looking for it to land. But it didn't. The plane just kept on flying straight away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the horizon. For the rest of the day, Carl just stared off into the distance, hoping for this plane to come back. But it didn't. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He was so shaken up by what had happened that day. He didn't understand, he saw the pilot. The pilot seemed like they were looking back at him. Why didn't they land? Why didn't they stop? Carl told himself that, maybe the terrain was too rough and there was no way for the pilot to land. That was possible. And so perhaps this pilot was flying back and getting another plane, maybe a float plane to land on the water. Carl didn't know, but he felt like that could be a possibility, and it sort of made him feel a little bit better. But he still couldn't relax enough to sleep. And so, knowing he was just going to lay there all night, he sat up, turned on his flashlight, and began looking for something to read, just to occupy his mind. Now, at this point, Carl has been out in the wilderness all alone for months and months, and he's been stranded for weeks. He has read all of his books and all of his magazines like 1,000,000 times. He's even read his diary 12 times. I mean, he's read everything. And so as he was looking around his tent, he was looking for literally anything else to read. And suddenly, he found something. His hunting license. It was like the one thing he had not closely read. Not an exciting thing to read, but new. It was just a little paper certificate with some rules and regulations and safety tips about hunting. And so Carl just began reading the front, and he read it all the way down, and then he flipped it over and he continued reading, but then he saw something that made his heart practically stop. At first he thought maybe he misunderstood, but no, he read it over and over again, and it was very clear. And so Carl looked up in shock. He suddenly understood why that pilot had left him. For weeks, Carl stayed close to his camp, just hoping and praying that somehow, some way, that plane would still come back. But it never did. And by the time Carl had actually accepted this fact, that really the plane's not coming back, well, by that point, it was too late to try to hike out. So all he could do was stay put. However, the lake had frozen over, so he couldn't fish. His snares all sat empty because all the wolves and foxes got to his catches before he could. By October, Carl was getting really skinny. By November, Carl was genuinely starving. On November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Carl laid inside of his tent and made a diary entry. There would be no Thanksgiving feast for him today. His food stores were totally gone, and the Arctic winter was getting so bad. In fact, his fingers and toes were turning black from frostbite, and he was sick all the time and constantly had chills. And as Carl wrote in his diary, he looked out the tent flap at his dying fire, knowing he had no more firewood. He knew he only had one choice left to make. He scratched a final sentence into his diary. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he set his diary on the floor of the tent near his rolls of film. Then he reached for his rifle and his last box of ammo. A little while later, a single shot rang out across the lake. A couple months later, in early February of 1982, Alaska State Troopers would find Carl. Carl was deceased. He had taken his own life. What Carl had only realized later was that when he made that fist pump, when he was so excited when that pilot had flown overhead and he thought he was going to get rescued, well, that fist pump had sealed his fate. Because, like it said on Carl's hunting license, a single arm raised in the air is the universally recognized body sign for all okay, do not wait. And so when that Alaska State Trooper pilot flew over Carl's camp, he did make eye contact with Carl. He saw him, but he also saw Carl raising his fist in the air and thought he was okay, and so he turned around and he left. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known to have raised two hands in the air as the pilot flew over for the universal sign that means, pick me up. And now, here is a clip from the latest episode of Redacted. Enjoy.
On May 2nd, 1945, a U.S. Army private stood guard at the base of a remote mountain in Austria. He was still riding high from the news he'd heard on the radio recently. German leader Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. The soldier knew it was just a matter of time until World War II was over and he could go back home to America. Just then, he noticed someone barreling down the mountain on a bicycle. The soldier realized it was a young man with blonde hair and civilian clothes, but he couldn't tell if the man was friend or foe. He pointed his gun at the man as he hurtled toward him. He wasn't about to risk anything in the last days of the war. He ordered the man to drop his bike and put up his hands. The man did as he was told. Then, in broken English, he said he was one of hundreds of scientists that worked for the Nazi regime who had gone into hiding because Nazi leadership had ordered them to be executed. The man said the Nazis would rather